Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to go over the basics of Chapter 5, which really focuses on percents. And so before we take a look at some percentage problems, the first thing that we need to do is to figure out how to convert percents, whether it's changing percents into decimals or decimals into percents, or even fractions into percents. And so for this first example, I'm going to show you how to convert decimals to percents, and it's really easy. The first step is to move your decimal point 2 places to the right. If necessary, add zeros. And the second step is to simply add a percent symbol at the end of the number. And so if we have 0.63 as our decimal, we're going to move our decimal place 2 over to the right, and so that becomes 63 point. And just because we have a decimal here, I'll add a 0, although it's not necessary. And then so step 2 is to simply add the percent symbol. So 0.63 or 0.63 is equivalent to 63%. And so we can do the same thing for 0.15, I'll move my decimal place 2 over to the right. That gives me 15.0, which is equivalent to 15%. Okay, in this case, we have 0.8. If I move this 2 places to the right, notice that we don't have anything here. So that means we're going to have to add a 0. So that becomes 0.80. And so when I move that over to the right, that becomes 80%. So 0.8 is equivalent to 80%. And finally, we have 0.52. Moving that decimal 2 over to the right is equivalent to 52%. Okay, we can do the opposite and convert percents to decimals by another 2-step process. So the first step is to drop your percent symbol, and then you'll move your decimal point 2 places to the left. Okay, and if necessary, you're going to have to add zeros. So when we have 31%, the first step would be to drop the percent symbol. Okay, and remember 31% is basically the same as 31.0. So step 2 just tells me to move that over 2 places to the left. And so this becomes 0.31. So 0.31 is equivalent to 31%. When we have something like 100%, okay, I'm going to get rid of my percent symbol. And then I'll move my decimal place 2 over to the left. Okay, and this gives me a whole number 1, which is equivalent to 100%. Sometimes you'll encounter fraction percents, and we can convert these into decimals as well. So whenever you have a fraction percent, you always want to convert the fractional part first. So here I have 3 1/3%. Okay, so I'm going to cover the 1/3 first. And so 1/3 as a decimal is, and I'm just going to round this to the hundredths place. So 0.33. Okay, and then what I'll do is to add my whole number. So 0.33 plus 3, and this was percent, gives me 3.33%. Okay, now that I have converted this into a decimal percent, I need to convert this into a decimal. And so just like the previous example, what I need to do is to move my decimal place 2 over to the left, and that gives me 0.0333. So 3 1/3% is equivalent to 0.0333. And so here we have 33 2/3. So again, I'm going to focus on the fraction first and convert that into a decimal. if I round this, and I'm just going to put the percent symbol there. If I round this to the nearest hundredth, that is 0.67. Now that I have my decimal part, I'm going to add the 33 from the whole number. Remember, we're still working with the percents here. So this becomes 33.67%. And then now I can go ahead and convert this to a decimal. And this becomes 0.3367. Okay, for 2 1/4, 1/4% is equivalent to 0.25%. Okay, I'll add that to the whole number 2, which is equivalent to 2.25%. And converting this into a decimal, that's going to give me 0.0225. Okay, and I'm just going to move this down a little bit. So here we have convert decimal fractions to percent. So notice here we have a decimal that's actually mixed with a fraction. So what we want to do is to first take care of my fraction. So dividing my numerator by the denominator. So 1/4, and that's equivalent to 0.25. Okay, and now I need to add that to the 0.08. Okay, and so this becomes, so remember it was 0.08. So adding that gives me 0.0825. So we just put this after the 0.08, and now I can convert this into a percent. And this becomes 8.25%. Okay, in this next section, and this is a really important part of what we'll be learning this week. So we're going to focus on your base, rate, and percentage. And so when we use the term percentage, we're not talking about the number that's in front of the percent symbol. Okay, that's actually called your rate. Your percentage, which is also known as your portion, is the amount of the part that results from your base being multiplied by your rate. And so the formula for your percentage or your portion, if it helps you distinguish them better, okay, is your base times your rate. So your rate is always the number with the percent symbol. So 0.375% is my rate, and of is my base. Okay, and you can usually tell the number that your base is because it's usually after the word of. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at word problems or even in your regular homework. Okay, and so with this 0.0375%, the first thing that we want to do is to convert that into a decimal. So remember, to convert that to a decimal, you move your decimal place 2 over to the left. That becomes 0.00375. And now I can multiply that by my base of 56. Okay, and this is going to give me 0.21. So 0.21 is 0.375% of 56. Okay, for this next one, again, remember, whatever number has that percent symbol is your rate. And of 1200, so that's my base. So I'm going to convert 7.5% to a decimal. So 7.5%. becomes 0.075. Now that I've converted that, I can multiply it by my base, and that's going to be 90. Okay, and then finally we have 100%. So 100% is equivalent to 1 whole as a decimal, and times my base of 11.17 simply gives me 11.17 as my percentage or my portion. In this next section, we'll try to calculate the base. So your base is your beginning or the whole unit that we're trying to take from. Okay, and so the formula to find your base is your portion or your percentage amount over your rate. So here, 35% is my rate. Again, I know it's my rate because we have that percent symbol. Okay, and then of blank is $70. So we know our rate and our portion. And now it's simply a matter of plugging in these values into this formula. So my portion is my numerator, my rate is my denominator. Okay, and notice that I converted it to a decimal. Okay, and so that's why we spent the first part of this video going over converting percentages into decimals, and also the opposite, because you're going to be needing that throughout the rest of the semester to know how to do that. Okay, so 70 over 0.35 gives me 200, and because this is a dollar amount, I'll just add the dollar symbol. So make sure that you do add the dollar sign, if you're handwriting this in front of your number. If it was a monetary amount, I know I've had a lot of students in the past who've put their dollar signs after the numbers, so just make sure you don't do that. Your dollar sign will always go in front of the monetary value. And so what this problem really tells us is that 35% of $200 is $70. Okay, so here we have 80% of blank is 96 cents. So we have our rate, we know our portion or our percentage. And again, I'm just plugging in the values into my formula. So my numerator is 0.96. And as a decimal, 80% is equivalent to 0.8. Okay, now that I have my formula, I can do my calculations. And remember, I'm rounding everything to the nearest 100% or 100th if I have any decimals. And this one happens to be $1.20. Okay, and so I'll just verify this on my calculator. 0.96 divided by 0.8 is 1.2. For this final one, we have 3.75% of what is 27. So 27 is my percentage amount, and converting 3.75% into a decimal gives me 0.0375. Okay, and then I'm rounding this, but it actually happens to be 720 without any decimals. So this tells me that 3.75% of 720 is 27. So the final conversion or formula here, when we're dealing with percents, base, and rates, is to figure out your rate. So remember, your rate is the number that has the percent symbol. Okay, and so the formula for that, your rate is your portion or your percentage amount over your base. Okay, and again, as I said a few minutes ago in this earlier section, you can usually always identify your base because it usually follows the word of. Okay, so here we have the word of, and I know that that's going to be my base, and I'm going to just label all of these. So if this is my base, and right now we don't have any numbers with a percentage or a percent sign, so that means that these must be my portions. Okay, so now that I know these, I can go ahead and plug these values into my formula. So my portion over my base, and this is going to give me 0.20. Right now this is a decimal, but remember your rate is the number with a percent sign. So that means that I need to convert this into a percentage. So 0.20 is equivalent to 20%. For this next one here, I'm going to take my portion of 1.4, and that's going to go over 1.12. Okay, this is equivalent to 1.25. Again, I need to convert this to a percentage, so my decimal goes 2 places to the right, and this becomes 125%. For this final one here, we have 28.4 as our percentage amount. That's going to go over my base of 14.2. And this gives me 2.00. Converting this into a percentage is equivalent to 200%. In this next section, we just have to compute the amount and the rate of change given some certain values here. And so let's say that we have this problem that says decreasing the base value of 280, so that's my base, by 25%. That has a percent symbol, so I know that's my rate, gives a new value of what? Okay, so the first step we have to do is to find the portion before we can even add this problem. Okay, and remember, your portion or your percentage amount can be found by multiplying your base by your rate. And I'm converting that to a decimal. So my portion here is 70. So decreasing the base value by 25%. So if 70 was 20% of my base value, I'm going to subtract that. This becomes 210. So decreasing the base value of 280 by 25% gives the new value of 210. In this next one, it says increasing the base value of 240 by 40% gives the new value of what? Okay, so here again, we know our base, we know our rate, and the first thing we need to do is to calculate our portion, or our percentage amount, and that's 240 multiplied by 0.40. Okay, and this is equivalent to 96. So increasing the base value of 240, so increasing it by 40%. So that means I'm going to now add 96. Let me write that better. Gives us 336. Next it says sales were 8,000 last month and increased by 4% this month. So this means that sales were how much this month? So my base is my original amount that we're comparing. So that's going to be last month. 4% is our rate. So I'll take that 8,000, multiply by 4% expressed as a decimal, which is 0.04. Because we're using monetary amounts, I put a dollar sign, and this is 320 is our portion, or our percentage amount. So right now, this tells me that $320 is 4% of 8,000. So if last month's sales increased by 4%, that's equivalent to 8,000 plus $320, which is $8,320 this month. Okay, and then finally, we have this last one, which says a $17 increase in 10% of the base value of what? So notice that we don't have a base here, so we need to find the base. Here's our rate, and so $17 must be our portion. And so to find this one, we're simply taking our percentage amount of $17 over our rate. That's equivalent to 0.1 or 0.10. And this gives me a base amount of $170. So a $17 increase is 10% of the base value of $170. And so you can even double check that with your calculator. So we can see if $17 really is 10% of 170 by simply taking our base of 170 and then multiplying that by 0.10, which is 10%, and that is in fact $17, which is our portion. And so let's take a look at a simple problem where we're looking for the amount of change and also the rate of change. So to find your amount of change, you're always going to compare your last year and your previous year. And your amount of change is going to be your current amount minus your base, and in this case my base is 541. So 516 minus 541 gives me negative 25. Okay, and then the rate of change, to calculate the rate of change, is going to be by taking my portion over my base. So we have to figure out what our portion is and our base. So the amount of change is our portion, and then the base is our original year, or our base year, which is in this case 541. So I'll bring my calculator out for this, and so negative 25 over 541 gives me negative 0.046, and I'm just rounding to the nearest 2 decimal places after that. So that's negative 0.0462. But because this is a rate, we're looking for a percentage amount. So that means that we need to convert this to a percent. So 0.0462 converted to a percent is 4.62. And remember, this is a negative. And so this tells me that battery sales were down 25, which is also a decrease of 4.62%. Okay, and so let's look at this final example. And so this deals, in this case, with calculating floor space or even some other measurement where we need to figure out allocations. Okay, so let's say that the total rent of a store is $15,000. And here it's divided up into 3 different departments in this one store. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to figure out the complete floor space of each department. So 100 times 50 feet is 5,000 square feet. 50 times 60 feet is 3,000 square feet. And then 40 times 50 feet is 2,000 square feet. Okay, so the second step after figuring out our floor space, so step 1, calculate floor space of each department. And step 2 is to figure out the percent of total for each department. Okay, so to figure out the percent of total for each department, so I'm going to take my women's, children's, and men's. So remember that was 5,000 square feet for women's, 3,000 for children's, and 2,000 for men's. If we add all of those up, we get a total square feet of 10,000. So to figure out the percent of total, we're going to take first for the women's 5,000 divided by the total square feet, and this gives me 0.5. Remember, this is equivalent to 50%. So the women's department takes up half of the entire store. For the children's, that's 3,000, again divided by 10,000. That is 0.3, which is equivalent to 30%. And then the men's, that's 2,000 divided by 10,000, which is 0.2, which is 20%. Okay, so now that we know the percent square feet of each department, we can figure out how much in rent each department needs to pay. So step 3 is to calculate the distribution of rent. Because the men's department shouldn't pay more in rent if they don't take up as much space as the women's department. So what I'm going to do is to take the percentages and multiply them by the total rent. So per our word problem, it says the total rent of the store is $15,000. Okay, so I'm going to work on the women's first, then the children's, and then the men's. So to calculate our women's, and I'm going to use these decimals. So 0.5 times the total rent, which was $15,000, gives me $7,500. For children's, that's 0.3 times $15,000. That's equivalent to $4,500. And then finally, the men's department, that's 0.2 times $15,000, which is equivalent to $3,000. Okay, so according to their square footage and the rent distribution, your women's department should have to pay $7,500, the children's department $4,500, and then the men's $3,000 in rent. And if you add all of those numbers up, it should equal the $15,000 in total rent that the store has